December 15, 1967. 6 o'clock in the evening. Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The temperature was hovering just above freezing, and a light mist hung over the Ohio River like it was waiting for something to happen. The Silver Bridge was packed. Rush hour. People heading home for dinner, Christmas shopping bags in their back seats, radios playing low. Headlights cutting through the early winter darkness. The bridge swayed gently the way suspension bridges do, that familiar rhythm that nobody ever thought twice about. Metal groaning softly under the weight of 46 vehicles. 37 people just trying to get home. And then, at 6:05, the sound. Not an explosion. Not thunder. Something worse. A sharp, metallic scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before your brain can even process what's happening. The bridge twisted. Steel cables snapping like guitar strings. Cars sliding sideways, headlights spinning wild across the water. People slamming on brakes that couldn't save them. And then the fall. 700 feet of bridge collapsing into the freezing Ohio River in less than a minute. The sound of metal tearing, glass shattering, people screaming. And then silence. Just the current and the cold and the dark. 31 bodies would be pulled from that water. Some wouldn't be found for weeks. But here's the thing nobody talks about in the official reports. Here's the detail that got buried under investigations and lawsuits and structural analysis. In the moments before the bridge fell, at least 4 people reported seeing something up there. On the towers. In the cables. Something big. Something with eyes that glowed red in the headlights. Some people jured that, seconds before the bridge fell, something was watching from above. Of course, nobody believed them afterward. Trauma, they said. Shock. The mind playing tricks when it's trying to process the unprocessable. But what nobody knew, what the investigators never bothered to dig into, is that those 4 people weren't the first to see it. Not even close. That thing had been seen in Point Pleasant for over a year. Dozens of times. Hundreds of people had looked up into the darkness and seen those eyes looking back. But what nobody understood, what maybe we still don't understand, is that it had been seen before. Many, many times. And every single time it appeared, something terrible followed. Let me tell you about Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Population around 5,000 back in the 60s, maybe 4,000 now. It sits right where the Ohio River bends, right where West Virginia meets Ohio, and if you're not looking for it on a map, you'll drive right past it. It's the kind of town that was built for industry that never quite came. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and they all know each other's business, and they like it that way. In 1966, Point Pleasant was a chemical plant, a few churches, a main street with stores that were barely hanging on, and a whole lot of people who worked hard and kept their heads down. It was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. The biggest news of the week might be whose kid won a football game or who got caught speeding on Route 62. Every small town has a legend, right? Some ghost story parents tell to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. Some tale about a murdered bride or a Civil War soldier who never left. Point Pleasant had its share of those. The old munitions plant where they made TNT during World War II, abandoned now, windows broken, covered in rust and graffiti. Kids would dare each other to go inside. That kind of thing. But some towns pay a steep price for ignoring their legends. Some towns learn too late that maybe, just maybe, there was truth buried under all that superstition. Point Pleasant learned that lesson the hard way. I grew up hearing this story, pieces of it anyway, the way you hear ghost stories around campfires or from drunk uncles at Thanksgiving. For years, I thought it was just another piece of Americana folklore. Just another monster story to sell books and t-shirts to tourists. But the more I dug into it, the more I talked to people who were actually there, the less sure I became about what really happened in Point Pleasant in 1966 and 1967. And the more I realized that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that refuse to stay buried. November 15, 1966. About 11:30 at night. For young people in a car, driving near the old TNT plant on the outskirts of Point Pleasant. Roger Scarberry, his wife Linda, Steve Millett, and Mary Millett. Two married couples, early 20s, just out for a drive because that's what you did in a town where there was nothing else to do. They'd heard there were kids partying out by the old ammunition bunkers, thought they'd check it out, maybe join in. The TNT plant had been abandoned for 20 years by then. 7 miles of concrete tunnels and bunkers spread out across thousands of acres. The government built it fast during the war, then left it to rot when the war ended. By the 60s, it was just a massive graveyard of crumbling concrete and rusted metal, covered in vines and surrounded by woods. The kind of place that feels wrong even in daylight. At night, it felt like the set of a horror movie. Roger was driving his 1957 Chevy, and they were taking the back roads, the ones that wound between the old bunkers. No streetlights out there. Just the headlights cutting through the dark and the trees pressing in on both sides. They were joking around, radio playing low, not thinking about much of anything. And then Linda saw it. At first, she thought it was a person. Someone standing near one of the bunker entrances, maybe another kid from town. But the shape was wrong. Too tall. Too wide at the shoulders. And it wasn't standing still. It was moving toward them, and it was moving wrong. Not walking. Not running. Just gliding. Smooth. Like it didn't need legs. Roger slowed down, squinting through the windshield. And that's when they all saw it. All 4 of them at once. And that's important because later, when people tried to say they were drunk or high or making it up, they couldn't explain how all 4 people saw the exact same thing in the exact same moment. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, maybe 7. Hard to tell in the dark. But the shape was wrong for a person. The shoulders were too wide, hunched forward, and when it moved, there was something folded against its back. Something that looked like wings. Huge wings, folded tight against its body. But the worst part, the part that made Linda scream and Roger slam on the gas, was the eyes. 2 massive eyes, glowing bright red. Not reflecting the headlights like an animal's eyes do. Glowing. Like there was something burning inside them. And they were looking directly at the car. Directly at the people inside. Roger floored it. The Chevy fishtailed on the gravel road, kicking up rocks, and those eyes followed them. Whatever it was, it moved with them, keeping pace. And then it opened its wings. These massive, gray wings that seemed too big to be real, and it lifted off the ground. No running start. No flapping. It just rose up into the air like gravity didn't apply to it, and it followed them. Down the road, over the trees, keeping pace with a car going over 100 miles an hour. They were screaming now, all 4 of them, and Roger was pushing the car as fast as it would go, trying to get back to the main road, back to lights, back to civilization. The thing followed them all the way to the city limits of Point Pleasant. And then, just as they hit the lights of town, it banked left and disappeared into the darkness over the river. Roger didn't stop driving until they reached the Mason County Courthouse. They ran inside, all 4 of them, white-faced and shaking, and they told their story to Deputy Millard Halstead, who was working the night shift. And here's the thing about Halstead, he was a skeptical guy. A cop who'd heard every drunk story and teenage prank in the book. But he looked at these 4 kids, saw how terrified they were, saw that they were stone-cold sober, and he believed them. Or at least, he believed that they believed what they were saying. Halstead got in his patrol car and drove out to the TNT plant. He searched the area with his spotlight, and he didn't find the creature. But he found something. Tracks, deep impressions in the dirt near one of the bunkers. Not animal tracks. Not human tracks. Something else. Something heavy, with 3 claw-like marks at the front. He took photos, filed a report, and the next morning, the story hit the local paper. That's when everything changed. Because Roger and Linda and Steve and Mary weren't lying. They weren't confused. They saw something out there in the dark. Something that shouldn't exist. And they weren't the last ones to see it. Not by a long shot. Within days of that first report, more sightings started coming in. And not from kids looking for attention. Not from drunks stumbling home from the bar. From normal people. People with jobs and families and reputations to protect. People who had no reason to lie. A young couple driving home from a movie saw it perched on a rooftop downtown. A factory worker saw it standing in his backyard, wings spread, eyes burning in the darkness. A woman saw it fly over her car on Route 62, so low she could hear the sound of its wings cutting through the air. The local newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register, started running stories. At first, they were cautious, journalistic, just reporting the facts. But as more and more people came forward, the tone shifted. The editor, Mary Heyer, was getting calls every single day. People were terrified. Parents were keeping their kids inside after dark. People were driving with their windows up, doors locked, eyes on the sky. The creature needed a name. Someone, nobody remembers who, started calling it the Mothman. Maybe because of the wings. Maybe because it moved like a moth, drawn to lights, appearing and disappearing without warning. The name stuck. Within a week, everyone in Point Pleasant knew what you meant when you said Mothman. And within a month, everyone had an opinion about it. The skeptics said it was mass hysteria. A case of people seeing what they wanted to see, feeding off each other's fear. One person sees a crane or a large owl, tells a dramatic story, and suddenly everyone's seeing monsters. It's happened before, they said. Salem witch trials. War of the Worlds radio broadcast. People are suggestible. People panic. But the believers, and there were a lot of believers, pointed to the consistency. Different people, different locations, different times, all describing the same thing. Gray body. Massive wings. Glowing red eyes. No sound when it flew. And that feeling, that overwhelming sense of dread that every witness reported. Like the air got heavy. Like something was pressing down on your chest. Like you were in the presence of something that shouldn't be there. The police were called out dozens of times. They'd search the woods, the riverbanks, the abandoned buildings. They'd find nothing. Or they'd find tracks that didn't make sense. Or they'd hear something moving in the trees, something big, and then silence. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be caught. Or maybe it was just watching. Kids started having nightmares. Teachers noticed their students were exhausted, jumpy, distracted. Parents started walking their children to school. The local diner became a place where people gathered to share stories, to compare notes, to try to make sense of what was happening. And the more they talked, the more they realized that something was deeply wrong in Point Pleasant. This wasn't just a monster story. This was something else. Something that felt like a warning. By December 1966, the Mothman had been seen over 50 times. The town was on edge. And then, as suddenly as it started, the sightings slowed down. A few reports here and there, but nothing like the flood of November and early December. Some people thought it was over. Some thought the creature had moved on, gone somewhere else, found a new place to haunt. They were wrong. It hadn't left. It was just waiting. There's an old belief, older than Christianity, older than most civilizations, that certain creatures appear before disasters. Black dogs before deaths. Crows before battles. White deer before the fall of kingdoms. Omens. Harbingers. Creatures that exist on the edge between our world and whatever comes next. In Point Pleasant, people started whispering that maybe the Mothman was one of these creatures. Not a monster hunting for prey. Not an alien studying humanity. But something else. Something that appeared when the fabric of reality was about to tear. When tragedy was coming. When death was close. And the evidence, if you can call it that, was mounting. A man named Woodrow Derenberger reported an encounter with a strange figure on the highway, a smiling man who climbed out of a dark vehicle and spoke to him telepathically. 2 weeks later, Derenberger's wife died suddenly. A woman named Connie Carpenter saw the Mothman hovering over her car. 3 days later, her house caught fire, nearly killing her family. A teenager saw red eyes watching him from the woods. The next day, his father had a heart attack. Coincidence, the skeptics said. Correlation isn't causation. People die, accidents happen, and when you're looking for patterns, you'll find them whether they're real or not. But the believers kept tallying the incidents. Kept noticing that wherever the Mothman appeared, tragedy followed. Not always immediately. Sometimes weeks later. But always, inevitably, something went wrong. This raises the question that's haunted Point Pleasant for decades: does the Mothman cause the disasters, or does it simply know they're coming? Is it an agent of death, or just a witness? Is it drawn to tragedy, or does tragedy follow it? And maybe the most unsettling question of all, if it knows what's coming, why doesn't it warn us? Why just watch? Some people think the Mothman is a guardian angel, appearing to warn people away from danger. Others think it's a demon, feeding on fear and suffering. Some think it's an interdimensional being, a creature that exists in multiple realities at once, and we're only seeing its shadow. And some think it's a projection, a manifestation of collective anxiety, the town's fear given form and wings. But here's what I think, and I've spent years researching this: I think the Mothman is a witness. I think it appears when the timeline is about to break, when something terrible is locked in, inevitable, and all it can do is watch. It doesn't cause the disaster. It doesn't prevent it. It just stands there, those red eyes burning in the dark, watching as everything falls apart. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most terrifying possibility of all. That the universe sends observers to document our suffering, and they can't or won't do anything to stop it. By late 1967, Point Pleasant was a town living under a shadow. People were exhausted from the fear, from the uncertainty, from the constant feeling that something was coming. They wanted it to be over. They wanted the Mothman to disappear, to be forgotten, to become just another story they'd tell their grandkids someday. And in December 1967, they got their wish. The Mothman disappeared. But the price for that disappearance was higher than anyone could have imagined. Before we get to the bridge, we need to talk about the explanations. Because in any story like this, there are always people trying to bring logic and reason to something that defies both. And in the case of the Mothman, the skeptics had some theories. Theory number 1, it was a sandhill crane. These birds can stand up to 5 feet tall, have a wingspan of 6 to 7 feet, and their eyes can reflect light in a way that looks reddish. They're rare in West Virginia but not unheard of. A crane at night, seen by frightened people, could absolutely be mistaken for something monstrous. Except sandhill cranes don't fly at 100 miles an hour. They don't perch on rooftops. They don't hover silently over cars. And they definitely don't cause grown adults with no history of mental illness to drive screaming into town at 2 in the morning. But sure, maybe it was a crane. Theory number 2, barn owls. Barn owls have heart-shaped faces, large dark eyes that can appear to glow, and silent flight. They hunt at night, and they're spooky-looking birds. If you see one up close, especially in the dark, it could definitely scare you. But barn owls weigh about a pound. They have a wingspan of maybe 3 feet. They're about as tall as a football. You'd have to be deeply confused to mistake a barn owl for a 7-foot-tall creature with glowing red eyes. But skeptic's gonna skeptic, I guess. Theory number 3, and this is where it gets interesting: mass hysteria. The idea that one credible sighting sparked a wave of false reports, with people seeing ordinary things and interpreting them as extraordinary because that's what everyone else was seeing. This is actually a real phenomenon. It's happened before. But mass hysteria usually involves vague, shifting descriptions. People feeding off each other's fear, embellishing details, creating a mythology in real time. What makes the Mothman case unusual is the consistency. Different people, different times, different places, all describing the exact same thing. Same size. Same color. Same eyes. Same feeling of dread. That's not how mass hysteria usually works. Theory number 4, secret military experiments. The old TNT plant was government property. Maybe they were testing something out there. Some kind of aircraft, some kind of surveillance equipment, something that would explain the sightings. Except if the military was testing something in 1966 that could fly at 100 miles an hour, hover silently, and had glowing red lights, we'd sure as hell be using it now. And we're not. So unless the government developed alien technology in the 60s and then just forgot about it, this theory doesn't hold up either. The truth is, science tried to explain the Mothman, but Point Pleasant had already made its decision. They knew what they saw. They knew it wasn't a bird or a plane or a case of small-town paranoia. They saw something real. Something that defied explanation. And whether the rest of the world believed them or not didn't really matter. Because on December 15, 1967, the Mothman stopped being a curiosity and became a tragedy. And after that night, nobody in Point Pleasant was laughing anymore. Let's go back to December 15, 1967. 6 o'clock in the evening. The Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia, to Gallipolis, Ohio. This bridge was built in 1928, one of the first suspension bridges to use I-bar chains instead of cables. It was considered an engineering marvel at the time. Elegant. Efficient. Strong enough to last forever, or so they thought. By 1967, the bridge was 39 years old. It was showing its age. The paint was chipped. The metal was corroded. Inspectors had noted some concerns, but nothing serious enough to close the bridge. Thousands of people crossed it every day. It was the only direct route between Point Pleasant and Gallipolis, and closing it would have been a major inconvenience. So it stayed open. And people trusted it because it had always been there, because it had always held, because bridges don't just fall. Except sometimes they do. At 6:05 p.m., the bridge was at capacity. 46 vehicles, 37 people, all heading home. Christmas lights were going up in downtown Point Pleasant. Stores were staying open late for holiday shopping. It was cold but not unbearably so. Just another winter evening in small-town America. Nothing special. Nothing out of the ordinary. And then it happened. One of the I-bars in the suspension chain snapped. A single piece of metal, 2 inches thick, 11 inches wide, 55 feet long. It had a manufacturing defect, a tiny flaw that had been there since 1928. A microscopic crack that grew over the decades, millimeter by millimeter, weakened by corrosion, by stress, by 39 years of weight and weather and time. And on December 15, 1967, at 6:05 in the evening, that crack reached its breaking point. When the I-bar snapped, the entire suspension system failed. The bridge didn't just sag. It collapsed. 700 feet of roadway, cars, people, all of it dropping into the Ohio River in less than 60 seconds. The sound was incredible. People heard it from miles away. A deep, metallic roar, like the world was tearing itself apart. And then the screaming. And then the silence. Rescue effort started immediately. Police, firefighters, civilians, everyone rushing to the river, diving into the freezing water, trying to pull people out. some survived. Some were pulled from their cars conscious and coherent, shaking from cold and shock but alive. But most didn't make it. The water was 39 degrees. The current was strong. Cars sank fast, trapping people inside. Some bodies were recovered that night. Some took days. Some took weeks. Some were never found. 31 people died. 31 men, women, and children who were just trying to get home. Who had no idea that the bridge they'd crossed 1,000 times before was about to become their grave. And in the aftermath, in the investigations and the lawsuits and the trauma, one detail got buried. One detail that most people don't know about. One detail that, even now, makes my skin crawl. Multiple witnesses reported seeing something on the bridge in the moments before it fell. Something on the towers. Something in the cables. Something with red eyes. Charlene Wood saw it from her car on the Ohio side. Harold Stevens saw it from the riverbank. Mabel McDaniel saw it from her window overlooking the bridge. At least 4 people, in different locations, all reported the same thing. A large, dark shape. Wings folded. Red eyes glowing. And then the bridge fell. Of course, after the collapse, nobody wanted to talk about it. The official investigation focused on the I-bar, on the structural failure, on assigning blame and preventing future disasters. The Mothman sightings were dismissed as irrelevant, as coincidence, as the delusions of traumatized minds. But those 4 witnesses never changed their story. They saw what they saw. And they believe, to this day, that the Mothman was there. Watching. Witnessing. Present at the moment of disaster, just like it had been present before so many smaller tragedies in the months leading up to it. And here's the really unsettling part. After December 15, 1967, the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant stopped. Completely. Not a single credible report from anyone in town. It was like whatever it was, whatever it had been doing there, was finished. It had watched the tragedy it came to witness, and then it left. The town was free of it. But the price of that freedom was 31 lives and a trauma that Point Pleasant still carries to this day. The days after the Silver Bridge collapse were a blur of grief and rage and confusion. Funerals. Memorial services. The river was dredged for bodies. Families waited by the phone for news that never came. The town was in shock, that deep, numb shock that settles in after something unthinkable happens. Point Pleasant blamed the bridge. They blamed the inspectors who missed the flaw. They blamed the state for not funding repairs. They blamed the federal government for building a bridge with a fatal defect in the first place. Lawsuits were filed. Investigations were launched. Fingers were pointed. Money changed hands. But none of it brought anyone back. None of it made the pain go away. And in the midst of all that grief, the Mothman became something nobody wanted to talk about. The creature that had haunted the town for over a year was suddenly persona non grata. People who had reported sightings stopped talking about them. The newspaper stopped running stories. The whole thing became this uncomfortable, embarrassing chapter that everyone just wanted to forget. Because what do you do with a legend like that? How do you process the idea that a monster might have been trying to warn you, and you ignored it? Or worse, how do you process the idea that the monster was there to watch you suffer, and there was nothing you could have done to stop it? It's easier to just bury it. Pretend it never happened. Focus on the concrete, the explainable, the things you can sue over. But the people who saw the Mothman never forgot. Roger and Linda Scarberry carried that night at the TNT plant with them for the rest of their lives. They moved away from Point Pleasant, tried to start fresh somewhere else, but you can't outrun something like that. It's in your bones. It's in your nightmares. You see those red eyes every time you close your own. The town tried to move on. A new bridge was built. Life continued. People were born, people died, businesses opened and closed. Point Pleasant kept existing because that's what towns do. They survive. But there was a wound there, a scar that never quite healed. And every year on December 15th, that scar would ache. The town would remember. Not just the bridge. Not just the people who died. But everything that led up to it. The creature. The warnings. The year of fear and uncertainty. All of it. Some people left. Couldn't stand to live in a place where that kind of tragedy had happened, where that kind of presence had been felt. Others stayed, doubled down, insisted that it was all nonsense, that there was nothing supernatural about a bridge collapse. Others, the believers, stayed because they felt like they owed it to the dead. Owed it to the truth. Owed it to the Mothman, in some strange way, to remember that it had been there. And in the decades that followed, the legend grew. Books were written. A movie was made. Tourists started coming to Point Pleasant, looking for Mothman t-shirts and coffee mugs, taking selfies with the statue they erected downtown. The thing that had terrified the town became its biggest claim to fame. And that's America for you, I guess. Turn your trauma into a tourist attraction. Make money off your nightmares. It's capitalism, baby. But for the people who were there, for the people who remember, the Mothman isn't a tourist attraction. It's not a fun story to tell around a campfire. It's a reminder that sometimes, things happen that we can't explain. That the world is stranger and darker than we want to admit. And that sometimes, just sometimes, there are forces out there that watch us, that know what's coming, and that can't or won't do anything to stop it. Here's where the story gets even stranger. Because the Mothman didn't just disappear. It kept appearing. Not in Point Pleasant. But in other places. Other towns. Other countries. Always before disasters. Always following the same pattern. In 1985, in Mexico City, multiple witnesses reported seeing a large, winged creature with glowing red eyes hovering over buildings in the days before a massive earthquake struck, killing 10,000 people. In 1986, in Chernobyl, Ukraine, workers at the nuclear power plant reported seeing a creature they called the Blackbird of Chernobyl in the weeks leading up to the reactor meltdown. It had massive wings. It had red eyes. It appeared at night, watching from the rooftops. And then the disaster happened, and it was never seen again. In 1999, in Topeka, Kansas, witnesses reported a Mothman-like creature in the days before a devastating tornado outbreak. In 2001, eyewitness accounts from New York City claim that a similar creature was seen near the World Trade Center in the weeks before September 11. In 2011, in Japan, there were reports of a winged creature appearing before the tsunami that killed nearly 20,000 people. Now, are these reports credible? That's the question. Because after Point Pleasant, the Mothman became part of pop culture. Everyone knows the story. So when a disaster happens, it's easy for people to retrofit their memories, to convince themselves they saw something they didn't, to create a pattern where none exists. That's human nature. We want the world to make sense. We want warnings. We want omens. We want to believe that the universe gives us signs, even if we're too stupid to read them. But some of these reports came before the disasters, not after. Some were documented in newspapers, in police reports, in journals. And the descriptions are consistent. Big. Winged. Red eyes. Silent flight. That overwhelming sense of dread. It's the same creature, or the same type of creature, appearing again and again across the world, always in the shadow of tragedy. So what do we do with that information? Do we dismiss it as coincidence, as mass delusion, as people seeing large birds and mythologizing them after the fact? Or do we consider the possibility that there's something real here? Something we don't understand, something that exists outside our current scientific framework, something that appears when the fabric of reality is about to tear? I don't have the answer. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a paranormal investigator. I'm just someone who spent way too much time reading about this, talking to witnesses, trying to make sense of something that might not have a sense to make. But I'll tell you this, the more I learn about the Mothman, the more I believe that Point Pleasant wasn't unique. It was just the most documented case. The one that happened in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where the story couldn't be buried, where the witnesses couldn't be silenced. But it's happening everywhere. It's always been happening. And maybe, just maybe, it always will be. So let's come back to the title of this story. The truth about the Mothman was buried until the bridge finally fell. What does that mean? What truth are we talking about? I think the truth is this: Point Pleasant saw something in 1966 and 1967. Something real. Not a bird, not a plane, not a case of small-town hysteria. They saw a creature, or an entity, or a phenomenon that we don't have a name for. Something that exists on the margins of our reality. Something that appears when tragedy is imminent. And instead of investigating it, instead of trying to understand it, instead of taking those witnesses seriously, the world dismissed them. Mocked them. Buried their stories under skepticism and scientific explanations that didn't quite fit. And then the bridge fell. 31 people died. And suddenly, the Mothman wasn't funny anymore. It wasn't a quirky local legend. It was a harbinger of death. A witness to disaster. And that truth, the truth that maybe, just maybe, we could have listened, could have paid attention, could have taken the warning seriously, that truth was too painful to confront. So it got buried. Officially, the bridge fell because of a structural defect. Period. End of story. The Mothman had nothing to do with it. But the people who were there know better. They know that something was present in Point Pleasant during those 13 months. They know that it appeared before the worst disaster in the town's history. And they know that after the bridge fell, it left. Mission accomplished. Tragedy witnessed. Time to move on. Here's what I think, and this is just my opinion. I think the Mothman is a witness. Not an angel, not a demon, not an alien. Just an observer. A creature that exists in the spaces between moments, in the gaps where cause and effect blur together. It appears when the timeline locks in, when a disaster becomes inevitable, and it watches. It doesn't cause the tragedy. It doesn't prevent it. It just records it, in whatever way such a creature records things. And then it moves on, looking for the next fracture, the next breaking point, the next moment when everything falls apart. And if that's true, if the Mothman really is just a witness, then what does that say about the universe? What does it say about us? It says we're being watched. It says our suffering matters enough to be documented, but not enough to be prevented. It says that somewhere, somehow, there's a record of every disaster, every tragedy, every moment when things went wrong. And maybe that's comforting, in a strange way. Maybe it means we're not alone. Or maybe it's the most horrifying thing imaginable. That the universe sends observers to watch us die, and they do nothing to stop it. The truth about the Mothman was buried because it was too strange to accept and too terrifying to confront. But it's still there, under the surface, waiting for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to dig it up. And every time a disaster happens, every time a building collapses or a plane crashes or a bridge falls, somewhere, someone will see red eyes in the darkness. And they'll know. They'll know that the witness has returned. That the timeline has locked. That something terrible is coming, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, has moved on. The Silver Bridge is gone, replaced by a newer, safer structure. The old TNT plant is still there, crumbling and overgrown, a monument to a war that ended 80 years ago. The town has its Mothman statue, its Mothman museum, its annual Mothman festival where people come from all over the country to dress up in costumes and drink beer and pretend they're not scared. But the people who were there in 1966 and 1967, the ones who saw those red eyes glowing in the dark, they're not pretending. They're not playing. They remember. They remember the fear. They remember the uncertainty. They remember the bridge falling and the bodies in the water and the silence that followed. And they remember the Mothman. Some of them still see it, in their dreams, in the corner of their vision, in the shadows when they're driving home late at night. Some of them think it's still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next disaster, the next moment when the world breaks open and everything falls apart. And some of them hope they never see it again. Because seeing the Mothman means something terrible is coming. And once you've seen it once you've looked into those burning red eyes and felt that weight pressing down on your chest, you never forget it. It changes you. It marks you. And you spend the rest of your life wondering if you'll see it again. Roger Scarberry died in 2018. Linda Scarberry is still alive, still living quietly somewhere in West Virginia, still refusing most interview requests. She gave one interview, years ago, where she said she'd never forgotten that night at the TNT plant. That she still had nightmares about it. That she knew what she saw, and no amount of skepticism or scientific explanation would ever change that. She saw the Mothman. And it saw her. And that exchange, that moment of recognition between human and something other, is something she carries with her every single day. Mary Hyre, the newspaper editor who documented so many of the sightings, died in 1970. She was only 54. Some people say the stress of covering the bridge collapse and its aftermath killed her. Others say she knew too much, saw too much, and it broke something inside her. She spent the last years of her life obsessed with the Mothman, collecting reports, interviewing witnesses, trying to find a pattern, a purpose, a reason. She never found one. Or maybe she did, and it was too terrible to share. The families of the 31 people who died in the bridge collapse have their own relationship with the Mothman legend. Some hate it. They see it as a distraction, a circus act that trivializes their loss. Their loved ones didn't die because of a monster. They died because of a structural failure, because of negligence, because of bad luck and bad timing. The Mothman has nothing to do with it, and dragging it into the story feels disrespectful, exploitative, wrong. Others see it differently. They wonder. They think about the witnesses who saw red eyes on the bridge that night. They think about the 13 months of sightings leading up to the disaster. They think about how their loved ones might still be alive if someone had listened, if someone had taken the warning seriously, if someone had investigated instead of dismissing it all as small-town nonsense. They don't blame the Mothman. They blame the people who refuse to see. And then there are the researchers, the investigators, the people like me who can't let it go. We dig through old newspaper archives, track down witnesses, compare notes on sightings from around the world. We build timelines, create databases, look for patterns. We're trying to understand something that might be fundamentally beyond understanding. We're trying to put a scientific framework around something that exists outside science. And maybe that's foolish. Maybe we're wasting our time. Or maybe we're the only ones paying attention. Because here's the thing, the Mothman never stopped appearing. It's been seen in the years since Point Pleasant. In different countries, different contexts, always before disasters. And if we're not documenting these sightings, if we're not taking them seriously, if we're not asking the hard questions about what this creature is and why it appears, then we're guaranteeing that the next Point Pleasant, the next bridge collapse, the next moment of mass tragedy, will happen without warning. Without preparation. Without any chance to save the people who will die. I'm not saying the Mothman is a reliable disaster prediction system. I'm not saying we should evacuate cities every time someone sees a large bird with red eyes. But I am saying that we should pay attention. That we should listen to witnesses instead of mocking them. That we should investigate instead of dismissing. Because the cost of being wrong, of ignoring something real, is measured in lives. And 31 lives is 31 too many. The Silver Bridge fell on December 15, 1967. 57 years ago as of this recording. Most of the people who saw the Mothman are dead now. Most of the survivors of the bridge collapse are dead. The town has changed. The world has changed. But the story remains. And it remains because it's true. Not true in the way a history textbook is true, with dates and facts and footnotes. True in the deeper sense. True in the sense that something happened in Point Pleasant that we still don't understand. Something that challenges our assumptions about reality, about what's possible, about what exists in the shadows just beyond our perception. And maybe that's the real truth that was buried. Not that the Mothman exists. Not that it caused or predicted the bridge collapse. But that we live in a world stranger and more dangerous than we want to admit. A world where creatures we can't explain watch us from the darkness. A world where disasters lock in long before they happen, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. A world where the bridge always falls, and all we can do is watch. The Mothman is still out there. I believe that. Whether it's a single creature that's impossibly old, or a species of creatures we've never properly documented, or something else entirely, I don't know. But it's out there. Watching. Waiting. Looking for the next fracture in the timeline, the next moment when everything breaks. And when it finds that moment, it will appear. Someone will see red eyes in the darkness. Someone will feel that crushing weight of dread. And then, days or weeks or months later, something terrible will happen. And we'll all wonder why we didn't see it coming. Point Pleasant learned its lesson the hard way. They ignored the warnings. They dismissed the witnesses. They laughed off the legend. And then the bridge fell, and the laughter stopped, and the town was left to bury its dead and live with the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, they could have prevented it. Maybe if they'd listened. Maybe if they'd believed. Maybe if they'd paid attention to the creature with the burning red eyes that stood watch over their town for 13 months, they could have saved those 31 lives. But they didn't listen. And the bridge fell. And the truth was buried along with it. Buried under official reports and structural analyses and insurance claims. Buried under skepticism and science and the desperate human need to believe that the world makes sense, that monsters don't exist, that bridges only fall because of engineering failures and nothing more. But the truth is still there. Under the surface. Waiting. And every now and then, someone digs it up. Someone tells the story. Someone looks at the evidence and realizes that maybe, just maybe, Point Pleasant isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. The most documented case. The one we know about. But the Mothman has been appearing for centuries, maybe longer. In different places, under different names. The Thunderbird. The Jersey Devil. The Flatwoods Monster. Different descriptions, different contexts, but always the same pattern. Big. Winged. Red eyes. Appears before disaster. Disappears after. Watching. Witnessing. Recording our suffering in whatever way such creatures record things. And if that's true, if the Mothman and creatures like it are real, then we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question: what does it mean to be watched? What does it mean that our tragedies, our disasters, our worst moments as a species, are being observed by something we don't understand? Are we part of some cosmic study? Some eternal archive? Some incomprehensible experiment? Or is it simpler than that? Is the Mothman just a scavenger, drawn to death the way vultures are drawn to carrion? Or is it something else entirely, something we can't even conceptualize because our brains aren't wired to understand things that exist outside our dimension, outside our reality, outside everything we know to be true? I don't have the answers. Nobody does. But I know this: the Mothman was in Point Pleasant from November 1966 to December 1967. Dozens of people saw it. It was documented, photographed, investigated. And then the bridge fell, and it disappeared. And that's not a coincidence. It's not mass hysteria. It's not a case of people seeing what they wanted to see. It's a pattern. A pattern that's repeated throughout history, across the world, in different cultures and different times. And if we ignore that pattern, if we dismiss it, if we bury it under skepticism and scorn, then we're guaranteeing that the next time it appears, we won't be ready. We won't listen. And people will die. The truth about the Mothman was buried when the bridge fell. Buried under 31 bodies and a river of grief and a town's desperate need to move on. But you can't bury the truth forever. It always finds a way back to the surface. It always finds someone willing to dig it up, to tell the story, to ask the questions that no one wants to answer. And here's the final thought I want to leave you with. The thought that keeps me up at night, that makes me check my rearview mirror when I'm driving alone, that makes me look up at the sky when I hear wings in the darkness. The Mothman appeared in Point Pleasant for 13 months before the disaster. 13 months of warnings. 13 months of witnesses. 13 months of chances to listen, to investigate, to maybe, possibly, prevent what happened. But nobody listened. And the bridge fell. So the question is, where is it now? Right now, tonight, as you're listening to this, where is the Mothman? What disaster is it watching? What tragedy is locked in, inevitable, waiting to unfold? And somewhere, in some town, in some city, is someone seeing red eyes in the darkness and wondering if they should tell someone, if they should report it, if anyone would even believe them? Or are they staying silent, afraid of being mocked, afraid of being dismissed, afraid of being the person who cried monster in a world that doesn't believe in monsters? Because that's the real tragedy of Point Pleasant. Not just that the bridge fell. Not just that 31 people died. But that we learned nothing from it. We still don't listen to witnesses. We still dismiss things that don't fit our worldview. We still choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. And somewhere, right now, the Mothman is watching. And when the disaster comes, when the bridge falls, when the bodies are pulled from the water, we'll all act surprised. We'll all wonder how it happened. We'll all search for someone to blame. But maybe we should have been looking up. Maybe we should have been watching for red eyes in the darkness. Maybe we should have remembered Point Pleasant and understood that sometimes, the monsters are real. And sometimes, they're trying to tell us something. And sometimes, by the time we figure out what they're saying, it's already too late. Maybe the Mothman was never a monster at all. Maybe it was never hunting us, never threatening us, never trying to hurt us. Maybe it was just there, doing what it's always done, bearing witness to our suffering because someone has to. Because in a universe this vast and indifferent, maybe it matters that someone watches. Maybe it matters that someone remembers. Even if that someone is a creature with wings and burning red eyes that we can't understand and can't control and can't stop. Maybe the Mothman is the universe's way of saying, I see you. I see your fear. I see your pain. I see your disasters. I see everything that's about to go wrong. And I can't stop it. I can only watch. I can only be there. I can only bear witness to the moment when everything falls apart. And maybe that's enough. Or maybe it's the cruelest thing imaginable. I honestly don't know anymore. What I do know is this: the truth about the Mothman was buried when the Silver Bridge fell into the Ohio River on December 15, 1967. But truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. It claws its way back to the surface. It finds its way into stories like this one. It lives on in the memories of witnesses, in the nightmares of survivors, in the questions that refuse to be answered. Point Pleasant tried to forget. The world tried to explain it away. But the Mothman is still out there. Still watching. Still waiting for the next disaster. Still standing in the shadows with those burning red eyes, bearing witness to everything we'd rather not see. And the next time someone reports seeing it, the next time someone comes forward with a story about a creature with wings and red eyes hovering over their town, maybe we should listen. Maybe we should investigate. Maybe we should remember Point Pleasant and understand that the cost of dismissing the truth is measured in lives. Or maybe we'll do what we always do. Laugh it off. Call them crazy. Bury the story under skepticism and science and comfortable explanations. And then the bridge will fall. And we'll count the bodies. And we'll wonder why we never saw it coming. The choice is ours. The Mothman has made its choice. It chose to watch. Now we have to choose whether to listen. END